I was like, is this a hallucination? I thought ChatGPT was lying to me. I was like, this can't be real. I looked it up and I was like, this is amazing. Go deep into this.
Right. Yeah. The background on that is at one point in Canada, when we were working with these guys, we were also doing research on the MRI scanner at the university, which was about an hour and 10-minute drive, no traffic, from the prison to the university out on the peninsula at the University of British Columbia and in Vancouver. And we got permission. What happened was one day I was walking into the facility and there was one of my inmates in his orange jumpsuit and shackles and two correctional officers transporting him. And he's like, "Hey, Kiehl," he's like, "Hey." And I was like, "What are you doing here?" He's like, "Well, I'm here for a treatment. I'm here for a medical appointment." And so I talked to the guys that were doing the treatment. They, "Oh yeah, we escort guys out here all the time for their treatment." And I was like, "Wow, okay. So this is news." So we went back and we met with what's called the regional escort team, and we asked them, "Hey, would you guys be willing to bring them out for research purposes? Like bring out 5 guys on a Saturday, and we would go scan them, and then you would take them back." And I mean, they're good Canadians. They said, "Sure, that sounds fun. We can do that." They didn't even end up charging us for that. They just the Correctional Services of Canada, had thought there was value in the research as well and the collaboration, and so we ended up being able to do that. We brought out about 50 men over 2 years and scanned them in the university scanner. They secured an entire wing of the hospital. They were always concerned about those that might be more organized criminally that get a breakout or something like that. But what they did is they just they shut down communications at the facility. So there were no calls in or out for like 3 or 4 days, and they would always do it randomly. So no one would know when they were going to transport them, and then they would bring them out and we would scan them. And it was almost always on a weekend, but sometimes it was during the week just to try to throw a curveball so that they would bring somebody out and then bring them back in and no one would know, for security reasons. And so it was fun to learn all of those things just for one, but it was also that they brought them out, we would feed them, we would scan them, they would then take 2 and go back in one car that they had come out, and then they would put the guys in the van that they had brought when they had done the other things. All the guys really enjoyed it. They participated and they thought it was get out of jail free card for a day. In fact, if anything, we had everybody sign up to try to do that. And that was a problem because we could only bring like 50. But what I realized was that there was really no way to do these studies in large numbers unless you figured out a way to take a machine or install a machine. Originally, the plan was to find a facility and park or put an MRI in there. So just to, go ahead and put one in there. And then I found out that they actually put them on wheels and you can move them. And then I got really, we completely redesigned or designed one of them for research purposes, made about 100 changes to the trailer itself, all sorts of upgrades to make it capable of doing what we needed to do. And then we got Siemens to agree for the MRI to put in an advanced MRI into one of the trailers, kind of the most advanced one they'd ever put in a trailer. And then I was able to find a way to get it funded, so that's one of the reasons I left Yale University, where I was when I got this idea, I moved to New Mexico. New Mexico was willing to buy one. So the nonprofit institute, it's called the Mind Research Network. They were willing to help purchase one because they believed in this vision. And the machine we've been using it for 20 years now. We actually have 2 of them now. And the first one, it's been to probably 50 prisons in 10 states. It's been all over the place. It's been to pueblos to study rural, issues in rural populations. We've taken it to an elementary school to scan kids there. We've taken it to retirement homes to scan, a community of aging populations. It's really designed to go anywhere there's a base or concentrated number of patients that you want to study that, or that would benefit from this, who couldn't otherwise get access to the machine. And so, yeah, it's been just fantastic. And I guess that's one of the things that we've developed a really great skill set. We have a really good team that knows how to manage it, drive it, move it, park it, all the requirements, managing it, keeping it running. It's just been a great experience. It's been obviously the highlight of my career, but we've studied now more than 5,000 inmates.
Wow. It's
And
incredible.
there's the closest, if you will, academic competitor has maybe done 30, so it's pretty much, we've cornered the market on this side of it. But we collaborate with people from all over the world. I have colleagues that we write grants together to go collect data, and then we send them the data. colleagues at Yale, Ariel Baskin-Summers, Jean Desity at the University of Chicago. We used to do empathy work together. Dave Costin at Rosalind Franklin in Chicago as well. He's done a whole bunch of intensive stuff before that. Joe Newman at Wisconsin. Mike Koenig still at Wisconsin. There's just people kind of all over the place that we've been able to provide data for, and so that's
cool science.
Yeah. So and we continue. I do podcasts and stuff like this because it's really fun to educate people and to tell these stories and to provide it. But you never know, some Secretary of Corrections might be watching this and say, "Hey, I'd like to have this work in my state." That's happened. I mean, there've been, you get invitations, you get people, or you get people calling and saying, "Hey, can you come do this or that, whatever." And I'm like, sure, if we can find the funding, right? If we can find someone to fund it, or probably should start a GoFundMe page or something. I've never done anything like that, but there's a lot of stuff that we'd like to do that we haven't been able to do, and so we're still, cooking, running along doing pretty well. And like I said, I have a really great set of team and staff. Some of my staff have been with me for 25 years. We've worked through all the ups and downs of funding cycles and everything else, and mergers with the nonprofit has merged with two other larger nonprofits to just part of the things that happen. And so we've been had a lot of really interesting things. But when you look back at it and everything that we've been able to accomplish, I mean, every year we have a nice Christmas party or holiday party, and I try to sit back and just take stock of everything that we did that year and just how amazing it is. And I've been just blessed with just great staff that have been, just fantastic to work with. So.
Right. You're the Tiger Woods of scanning psychopaths' brains. Such cool science. I've never asked people to like and share the episode, but do it now, anyone that's listening, so that we can get this video to a correctional officer so we can scan more brains, because it's important. Yeah. It really is important work. So let's go into some of those findings then. When you scan a psychopath's brain, right, what are the findings that you see again and again?
Right. So we talked about the mobile MRI. That's how we've been able to collect the data. And the MRI allows us to collect both, typical structural pictures of the brain, that everybody's familiar with seeing. We can also collect what's called diffusion tensor imaging, or imaging that allows us to measure white matter strength in the brain, if we will, the connective tissue, kind of the wiring of the brain. We also measure brain function using a technique that's called functional MRI. So this is a technology that essentially is measure changes in blood flow or hemodynamics. And when muscles, just like your muscle uses oxygen when you use it, every neuron, like if I move my fingers like this, the neurons in the motor system, and in the control areas of the brain that allow me to move my fingers will have more blood flow going to them than they did before I did that. So what I can do is I can then map, everywhere that, blood flow is going when I present a task to you. So let's say I have you doing an empathy task, or, look at people getting, hurt, for example. So simple things like a hammer or something, like hitting them on that thing, and then you have this kind of automatic empathy response, and we can study whether we get the same empathy response in people with psychopathic traits versus not, and things like that. And then, and of course, one of our main goals is to try to understand at a baseline how people are responding to these things, and then what can we do to develop a treatment? Can we manage it? But what we talked about earlier is prediction. So if I scan, of a couple hundred, individuals with psychopathy, how do their brains differ? Well, so the most reliable effects that we find is in the structural analysis that we do. So we'll do a quantitative structural MRI analysis, which basically looks at every single pixel or voxel, three-dimensional unit in the brain, and it'll analyze the volume or the data that's in there, and then it'll tell us whether or not it's weaker or stronger. Basically, do you have more or less muscle mass and all the gray matter, the thinking areas of the brain? And individuals with high psychopathic traits, they have less gray matter in the orbitofrontal cortex, in the anterior temporal, right here bilaterally, and in the medial temporal, what we call the amygdala. And then there's a smattering of other areas that some studies find, like insula, which is an area that's part of that empathy network, or the cingulate, which is this thing that wraps all the way around the brain. And the cingulate is involved in attention and cognitive control. And some studies will find cingulate response differences in psychopathy or not, but not all studies. And so it's part of a network, and those regions, the temporal pole, the amygdala, the orbitofrontal cortex, I mean, almost everybody in the field would agree that those areas are commonly found to be different. And certainly when you work with a clinical population in a prison, and you work, so people have really high levels of the traits, and you do the expert rater assessment versus other types of self-report tests, then you're going to get very replicable findings.
Can you
And
explain what
so
that
we
is? The
published a whole,
expert rater test?
yeah, so the Harris Psychopathy Checklist, the PCL, that's the expert rater. So me and
Ah, okay.
expert, we had gone in and scored it.
Right.
Alternatives are things like a self-report test where I just give you a test and says, fill out the bubbles, tell me, do you feel like this? Do you think like this? And those can be really
Right.
manipulated, or you can just refuse. And so even though I've developed these tests and have used them before, I don't recommend those tests for the clinical populations. But nevertheless, there's some value in doing them in community samples and other samples, but we generally find that they're not that helpful in a clinical sense. So when you use the expert rater and you do the brain scans for clinical populations, that we do find really reliable things. And so the way we interpret it is that there's like 5% less working memory. It's like they have 5% less muscle mass in those areas of the brain from as early as age 12, 13, 14 that we've scanned. And
Interesting.
so that's one of the structural MRI effects. And then, of course, what we also find is that the function in those areas is often diminished. And so if you present stimuli to them that are supposed to engage the amygdala or engage the temporal pole, we see less hemodynamic activity in the same areas. And then what you can do is you can take that data and you can say, all right, well, let's say psychopathy predicts reoffending. Does the brain data predict reoffending as well? And
Right.
it does. And
Wow.
so, and I think, what we find there is, as we've already talked about, it's really easy to score somebody 40 out of 40. When they fit all the criterion, you're often left there after scoring them. Then you're like, man, their real score is going to be like 50 out of 40, but the test doesn't go that high. But the MRI scanner, it doesn't care. Like, it's just the data.
Right.
And so the MRI scanner has additional information in it that you can capture if you do it. If you analyze it correctly, you can find that information and then use that on top of the psychopathy score, and it'll find additional predictive value. So, so they complement each other. Basically, if you put just the clinical data alone in a risk equation or just the imaging data, we normally will find that the imaging data predicts a little bit better than the clinical data by itself alone. And so,
Interesting. That's kind of
yeah, and
unsettling,
that's
isn't it?
because, well, that's where it comes from. I mean, your
Yes.
personality, your IQ, your age, all of those things are in your brain. And so if we can find a way to decode that, then it should predict just as well or better than a clinical assessment. And I'll give you another example in a second. So that's one of the things that we find is that this neuropredictive framework, it adds a little bit more utility, but it also kind of also tells us what areas of the brain are relevant so that you can develop a treatment, whether that's a drug that works on that area or a TMS, like transcranial direct current stimulation, that we might reset or reboot it with the treatment. That the TMS is used for depression and a variety of other conditions, substance use treatment. And so we might be able to use it to treat those areas of the brain specifically. Like, you're not going to treat the visual system, right? So, but the issue is because there's nothing wrong with that in psychopaths, but it is wrong in other conditions. And so, but if we want to treat the temporal lobe, then we would be putting the sensors over the temporal lobe to try to, change those circuits. Just like if we have training modules, if we have mindfulness stuff, getting yourself to remediate or ruminate on things to try to help you be more thoughtful and mindful. Well, that's going to engage this empathy network, and that's going to hopefully make it be more responsive. And so then we would suggest mindfulness might be a good technique to work with psychopaths because we know what systems of the brain it works on. So that's how you kind of try to frame this in terms of the treatment application and the translational ability. But we did this first study years ago where when you're doing one of these tasks in the scanner and you make a mistake, your brain fires that recognizes that you've made a mistake. And you have both a cognitive process that I know I made a mistake, but you also have kind of an affective response that you're like, damn it, I didn't mean to make that mistake and I don't want to do it again. And so what we've been able to show is that the activity in the anterior cingulate, if you had really low activity there, that is, you just didn't care, one interpretation of the data, you didn't care that you made a mistake, you had low activity, that predicted reoffending as well as anything else that we measured, even psychopathy. So your brain response to that kind of cognitive control, this, attentional control, was predictive of reoffending as well as any other variable that we collected. And so that was the first demonstration, because we followed the guys for like 3 years after they got their scan, and we showed that the scan, predicted. And now what we've done, and so you can kind of take any variable. And so in that case, we were basically decoding impulsivity. So we were measuring cognitive control related impulsivity. We included behavioral tests of impulsivity. We included expert rater measures of impulsivity. We included the data, your behavioral data, but the brain data was more sensitive than any of those other modalities to the outcome variable, the reoffending. And then I was like, all right, well, how do I demonstrate this to people, skeptics, maybe you might even call them? So age is one of the best predictors. So when you're a young man, you're more likely to reoffend than when you're an older man, even
Makes
a couple
sense.
of years. But if you go back and you think about it, well, when I was, 20 years old, I had a lot of friends that were very mature and studying and going to med school, and they did not get in trouble. And then I had another group of friends that was more fun to hang out with. That was really silly and would go out and even though we were all 20 years old at the time, there was a gradient of maturity amongst those 20-year-olds that was different. Well, if I just enter your age of 20 into a risk equation, I'm not accounting for that variability in their maturational levels, right? So some are more mature than others. So we have this thing that we can calculate today called brain age. And what we do is we decode the brain imaging data, and we can identify what areas of the brain are, what areas of the brain predict your chronological age. And then we can identify departures from that. So in the aging literature, if you have a brain age that is, 75, but you're actually only 65, you're older than your brain looks older than a reference database of others, then you're going to have about that you actually test your cognitive decline scores are going to be about 75 as well. So your brain age actually predicts that you're going to have bad cognitive test scores or good test scores. If you're 65 and you look 55, you're going to have a cognitive test score that follows and tracks with that. So the idea here is just like we have growth curves for our kids, that your kids have these things that they're supposed to follow, and they're in the 10th or 15th percentile, like during pregnancy, they make a big deal out of these things. And what we're doing the same thing with the brain age stuff. So what we were able to do is we took like 1,000 offenders, and we threw their brain data into a big algorithm that kind of pulled out networks of the brain. And then we figured out which networks of the brain predicted age. And then we asked, well, of those networks that predict age, do any of them predict reoffending? And so it turned out that, just like you would expect, there were several components related to the age of these areas, the temporal lobe and the orbitofrontal cortex, that were more predictive of reoffending than chronological age. So your brain
Right.
data was more diagnostic for reoffending than was actually using, because it accounted for that variation in maturation. And so,
That makes
and
sense to
that
me.
was, yeah. And so that was one of a cool demonstration. Well, we've just done the same thing, with IQ. So IQ often is low IQ individuals are more likely to reoffend than high IQ individuals. And it might just be that they're more likely to get caught, but either way,
Right.
they reoffend. And so IQ is, of course, comes from the brain, and you can quantify it very readily with a variety of techniques. And so we did, and we decoded IQ in the brain. And it turns out the same thing that we've just said is your brain's IQ, like your brain age, is actually more predictive of reoffending than is your regular IQ. And so this is, again, an example of how we can decode the constructs that we've measured in psychology using imaging data, and it actually ends up giving us unique information. First of all, it predicts as well or better, but it also tends to identify the circuits that are likely to be predictive, which gives you treatment targets.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel